Hey guys, my name is Scott Fawcett. I'm joined by Noah Gamesh and Tyler Payton here to go over frequently things that we've seen in support and ways to sort of limit that. And I'll go ahead and turn it on over to Tyler.
Hi there, my name is Tyler. I'm the escalation manager with Veeam support. And today we're going to be discussing frequently asked questions from customers and frequently observed issues. I was asked to put this together, and what I did was I kind of went around and talked to the different departments here at Veeam support and put together a list of things we commonly see. In the support department, we kind of split things up by product. So we're going to cover a little bit of B&R first, and then in the end, we'll talk about some agents and some Veeam 1 things. So we'll get started with the agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about today about how to expedite case resolution, common support issues we see and how to avoid them. And then we'll have a little bit of fun with some stories, kind of lessons to be told. So start with the, our basic tips and tricks. The thing that we can observe easily is that our software is thoroughly tested by our quality assurance and developers. And based on the statistics we can see from cases that are closed, the majority of our issues that we run into come down to configuration and environmental, and that's where support can really help out. We have a zero deflection policy, so we're going to do our best to help you get that issue taken care of. Even if it isn't something directly related to Veeam, we're going to be there by your side while you're working with that third-party vendor. We're going to be able to give you that information to support why it might be something outside of Veeam, but we're going to be there by your side with a engineer to be available for that third-party call if that comes up. On the topic of case resolution, getting things taken care of, a lot of our cases come down to either known issues where we see a problem, we can provide a solution, or we look at problems that are going to resolve by going through some isolation steps. In the end, majority of cases are solved by having log files. Those log files can provide us with a lot of information, and the convenient thing about getting logs collected either on that first phone call if it can't be resolved on that first phone call, which I mentioned that at this point our statistics show that about 28% of cases are solved on that first phone call. So about a quarter of calls that come in are getting solved by that tier 1 engineer when they call in. And on that topic, when you call into Veeam support, the engineer you talk to when you first call in is not a scheduler. They're not a tier 0. They're not somebody who's going to get details and get you off the phone and get you with the real engineer. That is the tier 1 engineer. And those tier 1 engineers, aside from also solving 28% of cases on that first call, right now, this week, we're celebrating last quarter, they solved 97% of our cases overall. So we're really proud of our tier 1s. But on the topic of, expediting case resolution, my best advice I always like to give customers, maintain communication with your engineers. And when you create cases through the customer portal, upload those logs the first time around. Having those logs offline for our engineers can make things extremely convenient because they can take those log files, review them with the tier 2 engineers, review them with senior engineers, take a look at them, make that first response on that case valuable and something that can troubleshoot towards getting the situation resolved. So from that, we'll move into the first kind of most common issue. Within Veeam, we treat the VM like it's a virtual machine. We don't have a file level backup with Veeam Backup Replication. It's an image level backup solution. So in order to capture that VM's data, we are using VMware snapshots, and in the case of Hyper-V, we're using shadow copies. On the VMware side of things, we're triggering a VMware snapshot to occur on the virtual machine, which keeps the base disk from changing and creates a delta disk, which all the changes are written to. That snapshot creation, whether you've worked with it manually or maybe you've never worked with it before, snapshot creation is essentially redirecting all I/O from a virtual machine to a separate virtual disk. I mean, you can think about trying to switch hard drives on a running computer, how difficult that'd be. So there is a pause in communication, sometimes in the microseconds, sometimes we're talking 1 to 2 seconds, but that impact in stopping I/O can sometimes cause problems with software running within the guest. We do our best to help out, trying to determine what that could be. And we'll also be there by your side when we communicate with VMware to have their help with that situation. Commonly, we find that it comes down to data store performance, latency, number of currently open snapshots, whether there's previous snapshots on the virtual machine. Another known issue that we have seen that's a bit of a VMware issue that ties in with our use of hot is that if data stores are NFS version 3, if the VM is on a different host within a cluster and the proxy is on a different host, when that hot add operation ends and the snapshot attempts to remove, there's an NFS unlock on the file. There's a delay, causes a bit of snapshot stun. And we have a KB article that goes through how to go ahead and set up our software so that you could have a proxy on each host within the cluster, and then tell the software to use that dedicated host or that dedicated proxy on each of the hosts. And we'll just move on to the next thing here. So one of the things we get from our SWAT team, which handles our severity ones, is we get a number of phone calls about using the Windows file level restore. Through a lot of the software you use in Veeam, there's going to be wizards you interact with. They're going to have menus at the top that give you information about what you're looking at. And one of the most common questions we get is a customer gets to a point where they're trying to do a file level restore. They get to the last tab after they've selected the restore point, they've selected the virtual machine they want to work with, and then they have to hit finish to go to that next page. And that next page is actually a backup browser, which shows what was inside that virtual machine during that restore point. That apprehension about clicking that finish button really comes down to understanding what the product does and experiencing it. So it's always my advice, when you're working with our piece of software, try out all the functions, get an idea of how they work, and really kind of dig in and take a look at all the different functions. So when the day comes that you actually need to do a production restore, you've done one already, you've tested the functionality, you understand what it does, go through, learn what the options do. That's why, you're paying for an amazing product, which has a broad scope of capabilities. And it's a good idea to kind of know what you're working with. Noah, you had some feedback you wanted to provide on this as well?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tyler. So, guys, my name is Noah Gamash. I'm an inside systems engineer with Veeam. I do a lot more of the pre-sales kind of conversation with potential Veeam customers that are looking at purchasing. And this is something I always like to discuss with them to point out and actually walk through this, within our demo lab and show them file level recovery. Because really, at the end of the day, we're not restoring the full virtual machine here. We're just taking essentially a pointer file that's pointing to that backup file itself, mounting that onto a mount server, which a lot of times is your Veeam server itself, and then just showing you the contents of the machine. So really what you get is a pointer file on your mount server, and then the ability to just browse, just like you would within Windows Explorer, that backup file itself. So you'll see the different volumes there, the C drive, E drive, D drive, and the contents within that. Once you actually click into those different volumes, you can right click and then choose to restore from there. So really, you haven't ever really restored anything, right, when you get to this finish button. This is just something I like to point out that I always try to talk about, and it's kind of a big takeaway, right? You don't have to restore a full machine, just restore the individual file with Veeam.
Absolutely. And talking about restore points, we'll move on to the next topic, which is a common one, which is the question of too many restore points, retention not being enforced. These both come down to, we got back to in the second slide, which is configuration. Too many restore points. The software will create restore points based on the retention policy or the backup settings that are defined by the user. So one of the most common things we see is a customer has it set up to run the backup job, daily. They're doing active or synthetic fulls on Saturdays, and they're setting the retention to 14, and then they observe after a couple weeks that they have more than 14 restore points on disk. And this has to do with the way that forward incremental with periodic fulls does retention. Its only way of enforcing retention is to remove an entire backup chain from storage. And a backup chain is a full and all of the increments that are related to it. So in order for us to enforce retention, we have to have enough restore points to meet retention in the newer chains to cause the oldest chain to expire. long time ago, I coined a mathematical expression of maximum number of restore points equals chain length minus 1 plus retention. And the simplest way to think of that is if you have a job that runs once a day and you create a full once a week, your chain length is 7 because it's one full in 6 increments, and it creates another full and then 6 increments. So 6 plus the 14 that you set the retention to means you're going to get a total maximum of 20 restore points on disk. And then from there, some basic math, we can take that number of 20 and divide by 7, which is the chain length. And we can see that in reality, we would have about 3 fulls on disk at most. And this can catch customers off guard, especially if you're expecting 14 restore points to use 2 fulls, and say your fulls are 2 terabytes. Now suddenly this job is using 3 terabytes. The reality is that the retention doesn't define the maximum number of restore points. It defines the minimum number of restore points that are required. Ways to work around this. I mean, in theory, the best retention ever would be to have a full every single day, but not many customers can do that. And I've only ever seen one, and it was because they had a 300 gig full every day and a 30 terabyte repository, which, that can fit a full every day. But aside from a full every day, we can look at a full and then a number of increments, which is what you're doing with forward incremental with periodic fulls. But then you can also look at other retention mechanisms that Veeam is capable of doing, like forever forward incremental or reverse incremental, where we're creating a single full and then a number of increments required to meet that retention. Now that can have a trade-off. Obviously, with forever forward incremental and reverse incremental only having a single full, which is the point upon which all the increments rely upon, in reverse order or forward order in the case of reverse incremental. If something catastrophic happens at the storage level, then that full, which is now the keystone to the entire chain, falls apart, and the rest of the restore points fall too, which is, in my opinion, forward incremental with periodic fulls is the best method. It compartmentalizes the restore points, but if your storage can't fit it, Veeam gives you the tools to shape the job and its retention around what restore points you can fit on your storage. I mean, if you've only got 5 terabytes of storage and you can only fit 1 full and 12 increments, then your only choice is forever forward incremental. In the end, it really comes down to monitoring. I mean, my best advice I can give in these kind of situations is when you first start using Veeam, or you change the retention, or you add new servers, keep an eye on the restore points, keep an eye on how much storage is being used. Adjust the retention to meet the needs of the software. If you're running into error messages where you're seeing that it's running out of space, reach out to support. We can help you go through, understand what you wanted from the software, understand what the issue is, and we can try and help understand what configuration changes could be made, or give advice on, perhaps it's time to purchase additional storage, or consider maybe the company's goal of holding on to, the last 7 years in daily restore points is infeasible given the amount of storage they provided. Real story. Next one we're going to talk about is antivirus exclusions. This one's antivirus exclusions are kind of an interesting topic. A lot of people, with antivirus exclusions, you're looking at not only does it cause job failures, but it can also cause performance degradation. This has to do with 2 things. One, performance degradation can come from the backup software or the antivirus software itself interrogating the files we're writing. It could be an antivirus solution on the firewall, which is, inspecting every packet that we pass between 2 locations. And in the case of actually breaking jobs, we have found situations where anti-intrusion software running on routers or firewalls, or even software running on the guest, during a virus definition upgrade, it may get a heuristic definition of something that looks similar to a packet that we're passing, which can cause it to kill one of the processes we're using. One of the more common problems we run into with antivirus is we'll often get an error message like, we attempted to open a file, but it's currently in use by a different application. Generic Windows error message doesn't really give too much information, but what we end up finding in the end was that we created a file and then we went back to access it again, And in the time since we unlocked the file and went to lock it again, the antivirus had started to lock it and started to perform a scan. We provide a KB article out there, KB 1999, that gives you a full list of all the folders, all the different processes that need to be excluded to make sure that we're hitting that maximum performance. Scott, I know you had some feedback you also wanted to share on this one.
Yeah, so I run into this a couple times where we have, typically I'll run into it where we have multiple different types of antivirus going, where when you're doing, especially when you have the file on access and it's reading the file, sometimes it'll come across and the antivirus software will stop it. And sometimes I've had it block specific ports, so I can't make connections. So just make sure that you're aware of that KB article. If you have any questions, reach out to any of the Veeam engineers. We can give you the ports and any other antivirus settings that you need to make sure that your antivirus software meets so that it doesn't affect it. Sorry.
Yep. And on the topic of ports, our user guide, which if you head over to vee.am/help center, takes you directly to our user guide section. The full HTML user guide is an amazing thing to read. It's broken down into nice sections, but there is a section in there for every product that shows you a list of what ports are used to get communication from point A to point B. So if you want to know what ports you need to open between a Windows server and a CIFS repository to ensure communication, everything is listed there and available for customers to read through and implement. Sorry, my transitions between slides aren't going to be the best because we're jumping from disparate topics, but the next one's going to be performance, performance is one of those things. It's not a black and white issue. It's not a, hey, my job is throwing this error message. Okay, well, that's interesting. Here's the solution, how you fix it. Performance, it comes down to, this is working slowly, which then we have to lead in with the next question, which is, what are these expectations based on? If we're working with a customer, we need to understand why they were expecting it to run faster. And then once we can understand that, and then we can understand, okay, well, you're saying that if we write to this CIF share via Windows, we get 80 megabytes a second, but when Veeam attempts to write to that CIF share, it gets 20 megabytes a second. Well, now we have a standard to compare by. We have something outside of Veeam to give us the steps to know what we should be expecting within the software. Then we can start getting into discussions. If it's not something like that, we can look into discussions about, okay, did the job run faster before? If so, what changed? We can look at, also, is there more data being transferred? So if we notice, over a 2-week period, every day during the weekdays, the incremental files that were created were only 5 gigs in size. And then suddenly, every Thursday night, the restore point is 30 gigs. And then the next night, it's 5 gigs. Real stories. What we ended up finding in that situation was that every Thursday night, the customer's SQL database administrator had set up a full SQL backup to happen to the local disk. So what was happening was the job would kick off, it would create a large increment or a large .bak file from SQL, and then Veeam would back that up, and that would cause the job to run longer, unusually long. And even worse than that was that it turned out that the timing was perfect such that the backup job would kick off, it would create the VMware snapshot, and then about 12 minutes later at, I think it was 8:15, the SQL DBA's script for creating the SQL full backup would kick off, which because the backup job started, it creates a VMware snapshot. Like we talked about, VMware snapshots are Delta files. So that DBA then caused 30 gigs of changes to the disk. Well, this caused the Delta file for the snapshot to grow to 30 gigs, which is unusual. I mean, the Delta file should change as much as happens within the guest while the snapshot's present, but that much change in such a short burst of time caused the job, when it finished running, to then have to read that 30 gigs. But then we tell VMware, okay, we're done here. We've unlocked the base disk. Please proceed to remove the snapshot. When the snapshot would remove, the snapshot was 34 gigs in size. With versions of VMware prior to vSphere 6.0, when they implemented the mirror driver, snapshot removal was far more rough based on the size of the snapshot that was being merged in. So in that case, it was bringing down the SQL server and the web applications that were tied to it. That one ended up being an interesting resolution. We ended up deciding to, instead of having the SQL DBA do the backups, we decided to instead let Veeam use its awesome SQL log backup function. And if I may take a tangent, the SQL log backup function is amazing because we can leave behind an agent within the SQL server to periodically grab SQL transaction logs to then allow for granular down to the transaction restores back to the SQL server. So if someone sends, an accidental command that drops a table or wipes out a bunch of elements, with that SQL log backup function, we can actually restore the database back to right before that transaction was sent perfectly. Normally, without SQL log backup, your best case scenario with restoring with Veeam is to restore back to when the restore point was taken. So if that restore point was created at 1 in the morning, you're rolling the SQL database back to 1 in the morning. That's why I love the SQL log backup function, but it comes down to, if you use it, your SQL DBA can't use their log backup functions. We have to allow Veeam to control that. I digress. So on the topic of performance, there are a few things we can look at. With every job, be it backup, replication, or backup copy, software is going to give us a bottleneck to report on. That bottleneck is either going to be source, proxy, network, or target. And in some cases, when throttling is enabled, you'll see throttling. If WAN accelerator is in use with the backup copy or a replication job, you'll also see source WAN or target WAN. Oftentimes, when WAN accelerators are involved, you want the network to be the bottleneck, obviously. But if we're just talking basic source, proxy, network, and target, source bottleneck is telling us that the source proxy that is acquiring data from the virtual environment. In Hyper-V, that would be the agent that's running on the host if it's running in on-host mode. In VMware, that's going to be the proxy itself that's using one of the 3 transport modes, be that network mode, hot add, or direct SAN, to acquire the data from the VMware environment. And that's basically just telling us, look, I'm pulling from the virtual environment as hard as I can, and I'm not getting data fast enough to feed the rest of the people down the chain. Now, this is acceptable. Source bottleneck in all cases with high performance, assuming you have high performance, is the best bottleneck to have. I mean, if anything else is the bottleneck, it's something you can change. But the one thing you probably can't change is you can't convince the company to go spend, another $30,000 on a high performance SAN array for your backend storage. But if your backend storage, we're pulling from it and we're only, say, getting 20 megabytes a second or 100 megabytes a second. In the case of 100 megabytes a second, it might be because there's a gigabit network and, gigabit maxes out about 112 megabytes a second. But assuming performance is low and the bottleneck is source, we could look at different ways of acquiring that data. So commonly, there's a perception that in order of performance, there's network, which is the slowest, and hot adds in the middle, and direct SAN is the fastest. But the reality is that, in some cases, network transport mode can be amazingly quick with 10 gigabit networks, whereas the hot add process and the way it acquires data may be slower in that environment. So we can work with the customer to say, edit the job, specify a specific proxy to be used, and try changing the transport modes on that specific proxy that we've manually chosen. The other thing we could look at is, with the source bottleneck and any of these bottlenecks, you need to understand it's not going to tell you what component is the problem. The source bottleneck only tells you that the proxy can't pull information any faster. So it could be the network adapter. It could be the network connection between the proxy and the host. If you've got a bad configuration where you're trying to use a proxy in site B across a 10 megabit WAN to pull VM data from a host back on site A, well, yeah, your 10 megabit WAN is going to slow us down. And that's what's going to cause source bottleneck. And in that case, I'd ask you to put a proxy in site A so that we can optimize the read operations. So then the proxy only has to send across the WAN what actually needs to be stored in the restore point. Then we get into the conversation of proxy bottleneck. So with proxy bottleneck, you're talking about CPU utilization. So this could be, the user has chosen to change the compression setting from optimal or DD friendly to something like high or extreme, which, exponentially increases the CPU utilization in a trade-off for, marginal decrease in backup size. I mean, it's just like if you ever play with 7-zip and you've tried changing what compression setting it uses, you're going to get a little bit of change, 1 to 2%, but the trade-off is a bunch of resource utilization in order to squeeze that little bit. In that case, we could try, checking the compression settings, assuming compression settings are set to default. Then we can look at over allocation. We could look at building additional proxies in a VMware environment. Proxy bottleneck in a Hyper-V environment is mostly going to come down to the Hyper-V host that's being used. If on-host is being used instead of off-host, and that may just be that the Hyper-V host has a number of VMs already running on it, and we're asking it to do even more work, and it's just reached its maximum capacity. It's not very frequent we see Hyper-V with proxy bottleneck. It's more of a VMware kind of thing because the proxies are dedicated smaller virtual machines or physical machines. The next bottleneck is network. Network is the bottleneck measurement between the two locations. So if we're working with backup, network is going to identify that the ability to transmit data from the source proxy to the destination storage, we are noticing that when we attempt to send things over, we're choking on sending data fast enough over to the repository server. With replication, it would be between the source proxy and the target proxy. And in the case where you're going across a network that's slow, then that may be acceptable. If you know that you're sending things between two locations from your HR to your colo, and the connection between those two sites is 5 megabits per second, maybe network is supposed to be the bottleneck, and maybe you are getting as fast as you can get. We could consider, with Enterprise Plus, we could consider implementing WAN accelerators. We could also look at, increasing the compression setting on the WAN or on the source proxy to try and see if maybe we can squeeze a little bit more data across to get some better performance. Network bottleneck is one of those ones. It is in most cases, I'd say almost all cases, environmental, and it just points to communication between these 2 points is a problem. I mean, I had one case, that must have been almost 2 years ago, where we ended up finding out that every time this guy went from this one office to another, he thought it was all gigabit, and both ends reported as being gigabit, but somehow it went through a 10100 switch that somebody had stuck up in the rafters to use as a network extender temporarily, and they forgot to order a new switch. Crazy stuff happens. I mean, the software will find the weakest point in your environment because Veeam will run as fast as your environment will allow. We will pull data from the production environment as fast as we can. We will process it as fast as we can. We'll send it to the destination as fast as we can. We'll write it to the destination storage as fast as we can. There isn't really, there are the limitations that you can put on the software, but the default configuration is just go, go, go. You can throttle between 2 points. You can set up repository limitations to tell the software to go slower. You can set up storage latency control in Enterprise and Enterprise Plus to tell us if the data store latency goes above a certain millisecond, slow down or stop creating new tasks. But the default configuration is to go as fast as possible. And if it's not going as fast as you're expecting, we can work with you to try and identify what bit of the environment is causing that limitation. Speaking of target, and I got there, that's the same thing as source. It is, we are able to pull it in, we're able to process it, we're able to send it between two locations, but we just can't write it to the storage fast enough. That can come down to destination storage performance. In some cases, we find that it could be a connection to the storage. It could be the way we're accessing the CIF share, whether we need to manually allocate a gateway or not. Sometimes we run into Windows storage that has been formatted as RAID, or it has been built as a RAID 6 array. RAID 6 array has double the write penalty versus RAID 5. It's interesting, but the bottlenecks are what we can use. We can go through and, like I mentioned there in the slide, KB 2014 gives you how to use disk speed to kind of get an idea of what your expectations should be. So hop into the next topic on the topic of repositories. One thing we do see occasionally is the question of how should I configure this repository? How should I create it? My advice and the advice and the best practices is to always make sure that your repository is pointing to a specific folder which will contain only the Veeam backup files. Pointing the software at the root of a share on a CIF share or the root of a drive on a Windows computer, in both cases, when the software attempts to rescan its repository, it's going to go through every folder in that destination. It's going to go through every folder looking for the VBM files. It's a file extension. The VBM files contain metadata that tells the software, these are the other files in the location next to me. Now, even if that folder doesn't contain it, we're still going to go through it. So, if you point at your D drive and you think about all the other junk that's on there, you may have like old installers, you may have old backups from a previous solution, just some zip files you've tossed in there. The software is going to have to go through every single subfolder and spend that extra time. So by making sure that there's a dedicated folder for the backup files, we can make that interrogation of the repository a lot more efficient. And tying into that, there's also other problems. So like we mentioned, there's a little bit of a story. So, we had a customer who contacted support and they reported that they had all of their backup files for their file server disappeared. Well, what had happened is during their yearly cleanup, they had gone through and they'd started deleting files off the disk. And some of the files they deleted, obviously too big for the recycle bin, but one of the files that was good enough to go in the recycle bin was the VBM file. And the backup software, because it was configured to point at the D drive, rescanned the recycle bin and found this VBM file and brought it back into the console as an imported restore point. And at some point, the customer decided to remap the backup files to a different folder and unwittingly chose the backup restore points that were in the recycle bin. And the software, it's a folder. It may be the recycle bin, but it's still a valid folder. It's a valid VBM. So the restore points were created to that recycle bin, and the job proceeded to create restore points. And then their yearly cleanup process came around. They deleted extra files off the disk. This time they decided to clear the recycle bin, empty the recycle bin, wiped all the restore points for their most important file server. In this case, it's an example of why we always say one folder deeper. It should have been D backups as the folder, not just the D drive as a whole. This is why in the default configuration of the software, when you create a repository, if you tell it you want to create a Windows repository and you populate the Windows server you select, when you select the D drive or any other drive, it automatically pre-fills in the folder as being backups. I think, Scott, you had a story you wanted to share as well?
Yeah, so this was a fun one. This was a pretty large enterprise customer. They had something around like 300 hosts or something like that. So quite a bit of VMs. I had gone in to do kind of an update, say, hey, what's new and all that kind of fun stuff. And he's like, I've got this weird problem. About every 30 days or so, my backup jobs suddenly stop and I have to clone the job and recreate it because I can't get a restore chain out of it. But, it's pretty repeatable, but I just clone the job and move on. Well, I did some poking around. I couldn't figure out what was going on because the jobs were completing successfully. We couldn't figure it out. So we opened up a ticket with support. And it turns out that the SQL DBA, where they were running the Veeam backup replication database, was rebooting that machine every month. And they would do it during the backup window. So they would lose connection to it and cause the jobs that were in flight to lose their chain and have to start over. Once they stopped that, it worked great. Can't hear you if you're talking, Tyler.
Apologize. Sorry about that. So moving on, the next topic I'm going to talk about is slow VMware replication. Most of these are about VMware. There are a few things about Hyper-V. Hyper-V issues, for the most part, come down to analyzing environmental impacts. With VMware, there's more configuration things we can do on the Veeam side. It has a lot to do with how we can work with Hyper-V differently than we do with VMware. On the Hyper-V side of things, because the hosts are running a Windows operating system, we can make the host do work for us. We can put an agent out there and have the host do the operations. So we have the ability to get into the virtual environment a lot more thoroughly. In VMware, because their hosts run a proprietary version of Linux, we have to use proxies to get into that virtual environment. I mean, anytime you talk about a VMware or talk about a Veeam proxy with background replication, you can kind of think of it as the bridge that gaps the bubble of VMware environment and the bubble of the Veeam environment. It's what allows us to go in and out. So when we talk about replication, we need a proxy to get into the source production environment to grab the VM data, and then we also need a proxy to write it to the destination side. These proxies and their position is very important. So if we're looking at a replication job from two different sites across a low bandwidth connection, the software will attempt to decide which one's the best proxy based on its IP address and what subnet it's in versus the management IP address of the ESXi host. And if those are in two entirely different subnets, then the software doesn't really have any other way of determining what site that proxy might be in. So it might guess and it might guess wrong. So in some cases, we have customers manually configure their replication jobs to specify that this proxy should be used on the source side, and this group of proxies or proxies should be used on the target side. This optimizes the connection between the 2 points because a proxy is able to read data and compress it and pass it to its counterpart in the destination side, who can then decompress it and write it to that VMDK file in that VMware environment. The other thing is that when we're communicating that information over to the destination site or the secondary location where the replicas are going, we need to have some way of keeping track of the last state that the replica was in, which is what the replica metadata is. That replica metadata is used by the source proxy as a backup method of determining what blocks need to be sent over to the other site. So we need that replica metadata in the source site. I've seen some customers who have moved it to the target side, but it is then you're forcing the source proxy to have to read from a file that's on the destination to then determine what needs to be sent over the destination. So, making sure you got the two proxies, making sure that one is in the source site and one's in the destination. Some cases, manually making sure they're configured to be specified as source proxy and dedicated as a destination proxy, and then making sure that replica metadata is in the source site. And in some cases, I've even built repositories on top of the source proxy. Replica metadata is tiny. It's at most 64 megs, maybe half a gig for a really big server per restore point on the replica. So in some cases, you can just add an extra 50 gig disk to a source proxy that's a virtual machine and just make it a dedicated replica metadata repository to really improve that performance. Next one's, it's there we go. Come on, slide. So the next one is, one I think, Noah, you said you wanted to talk about this one a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Tyler. So this is an issue that support runs into, and it's something that we handle on the pre-sales side as well. Just trying to get a feel for the environment and kind of seeing what you are doing as far as monitoring is concerned. So with Veeam, we have two packages that are called the Availability Suite and the Essentials package as well. Now, these aren't the only products that we sell, right? But they are really the same thing. We just have the Availability Suite, which is not limited to a certain size environment, right? You could have hundreds of sockets of VMware or Hyper-V, or you could have a smaller environment, right? Just depending where we have the Essentials package, which is limited to 6 CPU sockets and below on your ESXi or Hyper-V hosts. These actually include the same thing. So backup and replication with Veeam 1. Backup and replication is the product we've really been kind of zeroing in on and talking about this entire time. Veeam 1 is a product that complements backup and replication very well. Veeam 1 does real-time monitoring for VMware and Hyper-V environments. It also will monitor and look after your backup and replication environment. So your backup server, your proxies, your repositories, really all of the different components, as well as the actual jobs themselves. On top of the real-time monitoring, it also provides a reporting layer, right? So the ability to generate PDF and Visio reports on a schedule, right? And maybe have those emailed and sent out and that kind of thing. A big thing we often see with existing availability suite and existing essentials customers is that they don't know they actually own Veeam 1 as well. They were sold the availability suite or the essentials piece, immediately implemented backup and replication, and then maybe weren't educated on the Veeam 1 side, or maybe they knew what it was and just had every intention of setting it up and never did. So, kind of as a second bullet point says here, use what you buy, right? If you've paid for it, if you have an availability suite license, Veeam 1 is at your disposal. It's really the same thing with the Essentials piece as well. This can help monitor for problems before they happen, right? And this is really a proactive approach, right? Instead of waiting for something to go wrong and then immediately opening up a support ticket, you can head off the issue before it ever even happens. So I did just want to take a couple minutes just to touch on this piece, right? And to ensure you guys were aware of what the availability suite and the Essentials package includes there.
Absolutely. Thank you. Appreciate that. I mean, on that topic also, Veeam 1 does integrate and let you monitor your VMware environment, your Hyper-V environment, but more importantly, sorry, from my standpoint as a BNR engineer, is it really has some great reports for BNR. It can look and see, based on your current restore point settings and how much is being used, how long will it take for this repository to be filled up? It's also going to give you an idea of, okay, show me a report that shows me all my virtual machines in my environment and when they were last backed up. It's going to give you the ability to see a report of what VMs aren't protected by the backup replication solution. These are like all the different reports for the BNR are quite important and amazing, especially when you get into bigger environments where you're getting questions from the management team about how are we protecting, how thoroughly are we protected. Veeam 1 can generate those reports for you and even give you dashboards to show you what's going on with your BNR side from the Veeam 1 standpoint. So Veeam 1 is an amazing tool. Especially my favorite has got to be hunting down open snapshots. That's just as a BNR engineer, that's one of the biggest things we deal with is the snapshots are an amazing thing. People use them in VMware. They open them and then they do whatever they were going to do, and they use that open snapshot in case something goes wrong, but then they oftentimes forget that they created it after nothing goes wrong. Veeam 1 can give you a report of what open snapshots are there. It also has the ability to show you even files that have just been on the data store loose that aren't even being used by anything else. Just go play with it. Yeah, even try the free version, try out the trial. I cannot recommend it enough. I think that's the word phrasing. Yeah, we'll go with that.
Yeah.
Sorry. So that's the BNR. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing I would like to say for Veeam 1 is that I've seen recently is that CPU weight has come back as a problem. Because remember back in the days, we had like 4, 1, and 5, and we had, hosts with maybe like 10 or 12 or 16 cores on a box, and we thought we were all cool and stuff. And so we were very cognizant about, well, if I have a VM with 2 CPUs or 4 CPUs, I have to worry about the scheduling on the back end. Now we're getting close to 48, 60 CPUs on a host. We're seeing VM size creep back up to 4 and 8, and that's becoming an issue again. Veeam 1 can run that report and tell you what your CPU is across your environment, CPU weight is across your environment, so you can kind of get an idea, is this causing a problem? As a case in point, I was doing I'm actually in the process of a POC with a potential customer, and we actually ran into this issue. And I hand to God that their CPU wait time on their environment that we set up was 26,000 milliseconds. So it's out there. Take a look for it.
Yeah. And just I think the briefest summary I can give on CPU wait time, maybe if you've never.
You cut out there, Tyler.
heard of it, is the idea that 64 cores available to be assigned to tasks from the virtual machines. From what it's been explained to me, and I hope I'm explaining this right, but I'm pretty sure, is that if you have a virtual machine with, say, 2 cores assigned to it, it only has to wait for 2 physical cores to be available at the host level to get its task performed. But if you instead assign 32 cores to a virtual machine, now all 32 cores at the physical level have to be available to facilitate that request. So this is where oversizing can be a problem. In our personal lab here in the support department, we had a lot of people who were building servers to test with, and they were building them with extraordinary amount of CPUs, thinking, well, if I give it more CPUs, it'll go faster. And what we ended up finding out instead was that the more people that created really big CPU count via virtual machines, the slower everything else ran. And when we forced everybody down to 1 or 2 cores and started using Veeam 1 to monitor for that CPU wait time, we actually saw a dramatic improvement in performance in the virtual environment in our lab. Yep, another reason, Veeam 1 monitoring. It's just gives you that idea, gives you the ability to see what's going on in your environment. Moving on to, like I said, we were going to talk about backend replication. We talked a little bit about Veeam 1. Going to move on to my friends over in the agents team. I asked them, what are some of the most common problems you guys are seeing over there? And the one we're seeing is the discussion with the recent integration of Veeam agents into BNR. We're getting a lot of questions about protection groups. We're getting a lot of questions about what is a protection policy versus an actual managed backup job. A lot of these information is in the user guide. I've got the link there. You'll get these as part of the slides from viewing the show. But we're talking about managed versus unmanaged. Managed versus unmanaged is going to determine who kicks the job off. So a managed backup for a physical server with agents is going to be kicked off by the Veeam backup replication server, whereas an unmanaged is going to be a policy that shows up as a backup protection policy within the Veeam backup replication console. And its job really isn't to actually kick off the job. It's just to periodically go out and make sure that the installation of Veeam agent on that physical server is up to date and matches the policy you've defined. And that causes then that guest to kick off on its own based on the policy we're enforcing on it. The next common question they get is regarding backing up failover clusters. And that a lot of the time has to do with when you're creating that protection group for a cluster, you're selecting the cluster itself, not the individual nodes of, say, a SQL cluster. More details can be found at the KB article listed here. And then a few questions that they've gotten recently were about CBT. That has to do with the new CBT driver that we released in the newest version of Veeam Agent for Windows, which brings CBT for REFS. In the past, with using NTFS in Veeam Agent for Windows, NTFS has a bitmap, it has a master file table, we can keep track of what's been changing, but REFS doesn't really have that. So we had to create our own driver, which allows you to then be able to use CBT with those larger REFS drives on those physical servers. File servers that used to have 5 terabyte drives prior to the CBT driver, we'd have to read that entire drive every time we backed up the server just to find out what's changed. Hopping back over to my friends over in the Veeam 1 team. This is, I think, Scott's favorite topic of the SQL permissions, getting those configured. Scott, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Oh, SQL permissions. Yeah, this is, yeah. So this is usually the hardest part about setting up the database backend for Veeam 1. I would definitely recommend when you do it, make sure that the DBA is aware of what permissions you need, and you can check the Help Center guide for it. You can just type permissions in the search field, and it'll tell you what role. Because usually the DBA is not going to give you SA rights. They may give you read only. You need to have certain level of permissions to be able to get in there. You need to be able to back it up, that kind of stuff. You also need to be right to it and all that kind of fun stuff. So usually.
Scott, did we lose you there?
Nope, sorry. I was talking and I had the whole story done and I was on mute. Way to go, Scott. So SQL permissions is a pet peeve of mine. I would definitely agree. Usually I run into this when we set it up, when there's a communication to the DBA. usually the DBA doesn't want to give out the SA role, and usually they want to give some sort of limited access to it, whether it's read-only or whatever they want to do. But make sure that you coordinate with the DBA to make sure that you have the correct permissions so that we can access the database and write to the database, grow it, all that, add tables, schemas, all that kind of fun stuff, so that all that functions can happen in the back end. That's usually the hardest part about it. And if you go to the Help Center guide that Tyler mentioned earlier, and it's on that link right there, it'll tell you what permissions are needed to be able to connect to the database, as well as be able to what the permissions that the user ID for Veeam 1 needs to be able to be to access the database. And you can use specific SQL ones, or you can use window ones.
Like he was mentioning there, SQL permissions with Veeam 1 are documented in our user guide.
Yeah.
Yep.
They are.
So
and it walks you.
There we go.
And it walks you right through it.
Indeed. Veeam 1 also has a unique thing in that it creates local user groups for who can access Veeam, the Veeam 1 monitor. That also has to be modified to add users in so that they can do certain actions in Veeam 1. All thoroughly documented in the user guide, and I welcome people to read it. The Veeam 1 team also wanted me to pass out that if you're using tagging within your VMware environment, and you've recently noticed with Veeam 1 9.5 update 3 that there's been some changes, KB article has been documented out there for KB 2402. Kind of bring some information into that. I think at this point, that kind of wraps up the primary chunk of this, and we'll kind of move over to the questions we're getting. And I see, Scott, you're helping us out with getting a few of those answered here.
Sure.
Scott, you see any ones you want to go ahead and point out, or?
Yeah, I just saw one come in about, they were asking about the instant VM restore feature. That's kind of a broad topic. So basically, when you do a backup and you want to do an instant VM restore because you don't want to restore the VM back, you can basically take that VM from the repository and mount it to your ESX host from the repository, and basically create a temporary NFS data store pathway, and then literally boot from your repository so you're running that VM on the ESX host. Once it's running on the ESX host, it'll be running up, so you want to make sure that both servers aren't running at the same time, because it'll be the same server. But you can then access that VM and pull whatever you need from it. I have a lot of times DBAs love this feature because you can do the instant VM restore, and they can go run SQL queries, pull, if they're trying to track down a specific problem, but they don't need the whole database, they can go run their queries or forensic stuff that they need to do, figure it out, and then you just turn it down and it blows it away. Also, there's a story that I had that I love to share, where I had a customer in Louisiana. They were a victim of a targeted phishing attack for ransomware. What happened was that the hacker went to their hospital's website and said, okay, I'm going to send an email to the CFO, which was listed on the website. They went first dot last name at domain name, kind of ingenious that. And it went to, in the email contained the message, please see services invoice rendered for services on blah, blah date. And there was the subject line was invoice underscore date at, with a PDF. And so that went to accounts receivable. The first thing accounts receivable did, because it was in proper English and didn't have anything funny on it, they clicked on the PDF. Well, that immediately bricked out their server. And then once that server was bricked out, that bricked out the file server. So basically, the kicker was that that hospital was using that same file server to do all the patient scanning for all the medicines and dispensation and things like that. So it kind of stopped them in their tracks. They got an email from the hacker that says, give me $50,000 and I'll let you unlock your server. And the CEO said, no, we're not going to do that. They deleted the server. They were able to restore it in about 20 minutes of total downtime, but the vMotion took about 8 hours. But they were up and running. Excuse me. So that's my favorite story about Instant VM Restore.
Nice. Yeah, Instant Recovery is an incredible utility. Like he said, it literally allows you to stream and run a virtual machine off the repository. Obviously, if you're going to do an instant recovery, the question sometimes I get from customers, what's the difference between instant recovery and full VM restore? Why would I choose one over the other? Instant recovery is great for when you need to get a server up and running so people can start working with it. And in the back end, you can migrate it off of our vPower NFS data store onto a production data store. Whereas a full VM restore restores the virtual machine and then you can power it on. Instant recovery is powered on, then start moving it over to production to restore it. I know we're getting towards the end of this, and one of the big things I like to put out there. A lot of customers, the user guide is out there, veeamuniversity.com. I think there's bp.veeam.experts, our best practicing document. And by all means, check out our forums. The community forums are not like a lot of other big tech companies. They're still moderated by Veeam employees. In fact, I think they're moderated by the actual product management team and the developers. The forums are also your great opt-in resource for getting updates from our Senior Vice President of Product Marketing or Product Management, Anton Gostev. Once a week, he sends out emails, including this last Sunday. We got an email sent out to everybody who opts in, signs up on the forums about the next patch that's coming out for background replication. It's going to bring support for vSphere 6.7, updates regarding vSphere 6.5 update 2. All of that kind of information is published in our opt-in forum digest, which is produced by the Senior Vice President of Product Management. So I highly recommend, even if you're not going to post on the forums, which by all means, please do. It's a great way to interact with product management, get those feature requests, talk with other Veeam fans, but at least sign up so you get those emails once a week so you can see what we're up to, get a kind of a newsletter. Very low on the marketing kind of stuff. He's more about factual details, likes to toss in some stuff about what's going on in the vSphere world, within the computer administration world. I think, a lot of the questions we've gotten in, we've kind of filled them out and answered them. And Scott, do you think there's anything else we need to cover, or we get to wrap this up?
Let's see here. I think we got most of them. If we didn't get to you, we will address you. I know I did take one specifically offline. If we didn't get to you specifically, we're going to go through and wrap this up and address your questions offline. So if we didn't get to you specifically, we will follow up with you.
Very good. Well, we appreciate you guys coming out. We look forward to helping you out on the support side. You can create cases by going over to the customer portal at my.veeam.com, as well as while you're on the customer portal, you also find all of our phone numbers to reach out to us. And we wish you guys all the best.